So, Abraham. I've been thinking about this dude for quite a while now, and he's actually a very interesting guy. And the more I read and learn about him, I realize that he's actually interesting, and he's a lot like all of us, because sometimes when we think about the patriarchs, we have this grand view of them, they're in a sense infallible. I wouldn't say infallible, but you get the point, right? They're on a pedestal. They're just a step above everybody else. And in a manner of speaking, they are. But as I was reading about him, I learned a lot about his humanity. So while thinking, pondering over that, I figured, maybe I should have a conversation about Abraham. And I guess I was gonna title it is Abraham as faithful as we think he is. Let's talk about it. Okay, so before we can get into it, we have to just go back to the beginning of his journey. After Noah, the flood, and Noah's lineage, down the line somewhere, we have Abraham, right? And he was living in Ur of the Chaldeans. And while he was there in Genesis 12, we are told that God told him to move and go somewhere that God was going to show him. Now, let me read the exact text so I'm not misquoting anything, so we can follow along. So in Genesis 12 verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing." Okay, so first of all, this is wild. Okay, so the Bible makes us understand that Abraham was actually 75 years old when all of these things happened, right? And being 75 years old and God asking you to move and go somewhere that he hasn't told you where you're going, he just says, go and leave your family. That's pretty wild. And I was just sitting there thinking about dang, Abraham is very, very interesting. To randomly hear a voice and just move on it, it takes a special kind of faith. But the more I thought about it, I was like, is it really that faithful though? And let's unpack that a little bit. Okay, so here's one thing I want you to know following this, right? Literally the very next chapter, Genesis 13 verse 2 actually talks about how rich Abraham was. He had a lot of livestock, a lot of gold, a lot of wealth. So I included that in my reasoning about Abraham, right? And I was like, okay, so Abraham living in Chaldeans, relatively rich. His wife was barren, and God asked him to move. Is that really as outlandish as we think it is? Is it really a whole lot of faith to actually make that move? And even more than that, when he made the move, it says he was supposed to leave by himself. But we learned that he left with his family, including Lot. Some of his family died in Haran, and then he continued the journey with Lot, but we'll get there. But for now, see, Abraham is rich, his wife is barren, no children, and he's asked to move at the age of 75 to a land that God did not show him. Okay, so let me put it in modern time so that we can kind of understand it. Okay, let's take Elon Musk, for example. He's an extreme example, but it's just to draw a picture. 230 billion rich, right? And let's just say he's living in California, and all of a sudden God tells him, hey, Elon, I'm gonna need you to move to Canada. And Elon is like, and he just moves to Canada, right? Granted, moving to Canada is a big deal, having to manage all these businesses, SpaceX, Tesla, Twitter, whatever else he's managing at this point. Moving all that to Canada, taxes, money lost, all of those craziness that goes with it. It might be tedious, but then again, is it so hard for Elon? He has a private jet, going to Canada, buying a house equal to what he has here. It's not that much of a leap. It is a leap, don't get me wrong, and it takes some conviction to do, but nonetheless, it's not as huge an undertaking that we will give it credit for. Like you just said, Elon moved to Canada, okay, he's $1 billion rich, right? But in the case of Abraham, I never thought about it that way. But nonetheless, he definitely took the leap of faith and moved. So let's give him credit for that. Okay, so now let's move along in the story, and keep in mind, when God told him to leave, he was supposed to leave with his family. Okay, well, his nuclear family, not to leave with his father or anything. He says kindred. Okay, leave his kindred specifically is what he said. Okay, so we learn in Genesis 13, as he was leaving with his kindred, when he was coming back from Egypt, actually, when there was a famine and all that stuff, on his way back, Lot was rich, Abraham was rich, and they're like, we are too big for each other. So what we have to do is separate. Basically, it's what happened, right? They separated from amongst themselves. Like, Lot chose to go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham went to wherever he went the other way. So basically, they were so rich, so wealthy in possessions, they literally had to separate. And here's what's interesting, right? Because it says in Genesis 13, verse 14 to 17, and I'll just paraphrase it and kind of keep it short, right? When they separated, it says, and when Lot was separated from Abraham. Okay, now hear this now. Okay, remember he said in the beginning that Abraham was to leave by himself with his nuclear family, but he wound up leaving with a bunch of people, which was not part of what God told him. But he did it anyway. And now, when God, by his providence, separated Lot from him, Abraham, fully, quote unquote, obedient at that time to what God had said, which was to separate from his kindred, that's when God showed him what he had planned for him, albeit not in full, but in part. But God now showed him the land, showed him the extent of it, and he talked about his seed being blessed, right? So, I just wanted to highlight that point, that he needed a measure of faith to leave. But even with that faith that Abraham had in the beginning, he didn't follow through as God instructed. But once it followed through as instructed by the providence of God, eventually God started to show him what he actually had planned, where and the extent of it. Okay, so now we're gonna move forward. Let's push the pace, all right? So after this, we know about Sodom and Gomorrah, the 4 kings who invaded and basically took Lot captive. Now, this is actually interesting to me, because a lot of the time when I heard the story about Abraham going to rescue Lot, it's presented as this remarkable act of war where, obviously with the providence of God, and Abraham basically went with a bunch of maidservants and defeated 4 kings. And that is a miracle. I'm not trying to downplay that at all, but there's some details that I paid attention to, and I was like, maybe it's not as, miraculous as we think, right? Because it says specifically that once Abraham heard about it, he left with what? Trained servants. Trained servants. So the people who went were not like just a bunch of random people. They were skilled with war and things like that. So going in wasn't like like, oh yeah, we're going there oblivious and just letting God lead the way, right? Obviously God did lead the way. However, just to highlight the point, it took a measure of faith. Like, let's just say Abraham had no military trained people and just went to fight against the 4 kings. If he did that, to me, that would be the truest form of faith. That's not to say, what actually happened was not an act of faith. Because if I have 318 trained men, I'll probably be a little bit more bold to go into a territory to retrieve someone who's dear to me, and in addition to that, like, he also had other things going for him, right? He attacked them by night. It was a surprise ambush, and the 4 kings probably didn't see it coming. Now, when he got his son and he came back, this is something interesting that happened, because when he came back, the king, when Melchizedek was blessing him, well, actually, no, Melchizedek. And when he came back with Lot, God spoke to him in Genesis 14, I believe. And God said, hey, don't be afraid. I'm with you, right? I'm your exceedingly great reward. I'm your shield, this, that, and the third. And Abraham, in that little text, I was wondering, why was Abraham afraid? What scared him? What made him, worry about the outcome of what he did? And I'll presume that whatever he did, he was scared of retaliation, right? And for me, therein lies the point. In as much as it was an act of faith, and God was definitely involved with him, there's an element of it that he trusted in himself. You know what I mean? Like there was God in him. And again, I'm not saying that he wasn't faithful. I'm not saying that he didn't trust God. He definitely did. And God was definitely involved. And that basically led to that victory and him getting Lot back. Now, after, God told him not to be afraid, Abraham talked about, he has no seed. His only person to inherit from him is Eliezer. And God basically promised him that, no, you have a seed that will come from your loins, from his own loins. So basically, he was promised to have a child of his own physical strength. Now, obviously, if I'm Abraham, he's 99. Well, he wasn't 99 at this point, but he being relatively older, it's reasonable to believe that he can have a child with his own strength, right? Because we know by science now, if you're, no matter how old you are as a man, you can father children. You definitely can. Now, the problem was Sarah. Sarah was barren. He had no chance of having a child with Sarah. So if God tells him that he will have a seed, I think that he had some faith to believe God, in that specific case. However, considering that him being a man can father a child at any age, I don't think it was as huge a leap of faith. I think because so long as the child wasn't from Sarah, it was very possible. So it doesn't take a whole lot of faith to believe that. You follow what I'm saying? And as evidence, when over time he wasn't quote unquote having a child, Sarah was like, hey, God has closed my womb, so you probably should have a child with my maid. And she actually went in on Hagar and they actually had a child, Ishmael, right? And for me, this is also another thing proving, the faith that Abraham had in part, right? There was some element of himself, and because of that element of himself, he wound up doing what Sarah told him. And he had a child of Ishmael. Now, it's not completely his fault because when God made that promise, he actually never said it was going to come from Sarah. So in part, he may have believed that he was being obedient. But we learn later, after conflict with Sarah and Hagar, and God later on promising him that he was going to have a child with Sarah, that was actually what God intended. Now, while we're on the topic, that's actually very interesting to talk about, because I believe that the point where he believed God to have a child with Sarah was where his truest form of faith was expressed. Now, Abram was 99, so it was possible for him to father a child, but it says in Romans, I believe, that Sarah's womb was as good as dead. Abraham knew it himself, so he had nothing, absolutely nothing to hold on to other than the word God had given him. No matter what he did, he couldn't make Sarah have a baby. It literally required God himself to make such a thing happen. And therein lies my argument, right? In everything else that preceded it, that God promised him, there was a measure of it that he could accomplish with his own strength. But in the case of Sarah, he had no hope at all other than God himself. So his faith, the substance of his faith, if you might say, was God. The object of his faith was God. There was no element that involved him. It was God alone. Now, at that point, once he had a child with Sarah, a little bit before that, God revealed himself as El Shaddai, right? The Almighty God, and proved his El Shaddai-ness by allowing him and Sarah to have a child when it was literally impossible. And I think from this point, Abraham's faith was firmly sure. Like, there was nothing that was going to shake this man. He sat there and probably thought to himself, if God can make this happen, I'm abandoning all else. I'm going to trust God. And this is also proved later on, right? Because we know the story. God spoke to Abraham, asked him to go sacrifice his son, and he actually followed through with that, right? And in following through, he went up to the mountain and God revealed himself and said, nah, don't kill your son, this, that, and the third. We know the story. Now, the point I'm making is, right, you're wondering, like, why is he saying all these things? What's the point or benefit of saying Abraham is not as faithful as we thought? Now, I said a lot of things in the beginning. Now, one, Abraham was not as faithful as we thought because there were elements of him that could be, that he could rely on, you know, like leaving from Chaldeans of Ur to Canaan. He was wealthy, had a lot of possessions, and had military power. So not unreasonable for him to move. And Sarah was also barren, insensitive. But all of these things, Abraham sort of always obeyed in part. But it's the providence of God that kept growing his faith. See, when God told him to leave his kindred, he left with Lot. And in the providence of God, he caused them to separate. Now, in their separation, God showed him more. And God told him more, and his partial obedience led to a more provident acts of God. You know, in a sense, the conflict may have been provident because it ultimately led to him believing God for the true heir, which will come from Sarah. So what am I saying in all of this, right? And ultimately, I'm not saying Abraham was not faithful. He is absolutely faithful. He is far more faithful than any of us probably have ever been. But herein lies what I'm trying to communicate. You know, faith often takes us taking a step. Now, that step doesn't necessarily mean that you may, quote unquote, obey in perfectness. That's not necessarily required. But believe the word of God. Take the first step. And the moment you take the first step, the providence of God will carry you through. Step by step by step. And that is the nature of faith. That's how we grow in faith. Little obediences, little trusting, leading to the ultimate trust and absolute reliance of God, his Son, and everything that he has promised. And hopefully this has been beneficial to you. And please, I don't want you to go away thinking Abraham was not faithful or anything like that. But I want you to leave encouraged, knowing that even if you were partially obedient, God is provident. And everything that God has said and has planned for you, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean wealth or any of those crazy things. But as far as what he has for you, where he wants you to be, his providence will keep you. But you need to take the first step. Okay, God bless you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this teaching has been a blessing, and see you next time.